March 7th, 1945. 10:17 in the morning. A 30-ton Sherman tank grinds through the ancient gateway of Trier, Germany, and the stone archway built by Roman emperors shudders under the vibration of its diesel engine. 48 hours earlier, a Panzerfaust rocket had punched through the turret of this exact vehicle and scattered the interior with the blood and bone fragments of a 22-year-old boy from Ohio. The commander never cleaned it properly. There was no time. He just kept driving east. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community and share these forgotten chapters of history with someone who needs to hear them. Now. Inside the town hall of Trier, a man in a spotless woolen overcoat is sharpening a pencil. He has typed 3 carbon copies of an official municipal damage report. He has his clipboard ready. He intends to walk outside and hand it to the first American officer he can find. His boots are polished. His fedora is perfectly level. His name is Wilhelm Klaus, and he has absolutely no idea what is about to happen to him. By the end of this story, a 4-star American general will order a 30-ton war machine to grind 300 years of German civic pride into white powder in the middle of a public square. The man with the clipboard will stand there covered in stone dust, completely unable to speak. And the crater left in the center of that ancient market will remain visible for decades, a monument to the exact moment the Third Reich finally understood it had lost everything. This is the story of General George S. Patton, Staff Sergeant Joe Barnes, and the day a German bureaucrat made the single worst administrative decision of his entire career. And Staff Sergeant Joe Barnes was 24 years old and came from Detroit, Michigan. Before the United States Army decided it needed him, he worked on a Ford assembly line installing steering columns into automobiles at a rate of roughly 40 units per shift. He was fast with his hands, good at reading machinery, and possessed the particular kind of patience that comes from doing physical work in loud environments for long stretches of time. He was not a hero by his own definition. He was a mechanic who had been handed a tank. Joe had enlisted in 1942 after his draft notice arrived on a Thursday morning while he was eating toast. He trained at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where instructors taught him to operate the M4 Sherman A vehicle the Army described as reliable, and the men who drove it described with words that cannot be repeated in polite company. The Sherman was not the best tank in the European theater. The German Tiger and Panther outgunned it significantly. American tankers compensated for this disadvantage with numbers, speed, and the grim arithmetic of attrition. You sent enough Shermans, and eventually the Tigers ran out of ammunition, fuel, or crew. It was not elegant. It worked. By the winter of 1944, Joe was rolling through the frozen mud of the Ardennes as part of the 4th Armored Division, Patton's preferred instrument of rapid destruction. The Battle of the Bulge had turned the Belgian forest into a freezing charnel house. German counterattack columns smashed through thin American lines in the dark, and for several terrifying days, the outcome of the entire Western campaign hung suspended in the icy air over Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division drove through blizzard conditions to break the encirclement, covering distances that senior planners had privately called impossible. Joe did not find any of this inspiring at the time. He found it cold, loud, and continuously fatal to people he had eaten breakfast with. By the time the column reached Germany proper in late February 1945, Joe had watched 7 members of his extended crew killed across various vehicles. His current bow gunner was a replacement named Danny Kowalski from Pittsburgh, who had arrived at the unit 6 weeks earlier, still carrying the factory smell on his new boots. Danny had brown eyes and talked constantly about a girl named Patricia who worked at a 5 and dime back home. On March 5th, 2 days before the column entered Trier, a teenage German soldier hiding in a bombed-out farmhouse cellar fired a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket directly into the turret of Joe's vehicle from a distance of 30 meters. The shaped charge detonated against the internal hull. Danny Kowalski was killed instantly. The explosion also wounded the loader and damaged the radio mount. Joe wiped down the control panel with a rag, requisitioned a replacement loader from the motor pool, and resumed the advance within 90 minutes because the column could not stop. There was no protocol for stopping. Stopping meant the momentum died. Momentum was the only thing keeping all of them alive. Joe had not slept in 48 hours when the Sherman rolled into the market square of Trier. His hands were permanently blackened with diesel grease and burned cordite residue. His face carried a film of engine exhaust that no field washing had fully removed. His eyes had the particular flat quality that combat soldiers develop after enough consecutive days of receiving fire, a kind of emotional pressure seal that keeps everything contained and functional, but makes it impossible to access ordinary human expression. He sat in the commander's hatch and looked at the medieval buildings around him and felt absolutely nothing about their age or their beauty or their historical significance. He was simply looking for firing positions. The strategic situation in early March 1945 was this. The Western Front was moving at a speed that surprised even the most optimistic Allied planners. Patton's Third Army had punched through the Siegfried Line defenses along the Saar River and was driving northeast through the Rhineland at a pace that left German defenders perpetually off balance. Wehrmacht units that had been ordered to hold fixed positions found those positions already outflanked before the orders finished traveling down the command chain. Entire divisions were dissolving into the countryside, shedding equipment, uniforms, and unit cohesion, as ordinary German soldiers quietly calculated that the war was lost and began thinking about how to survive its ending. In this environment of cascading collapse, thousands of German towns and villages were passing into Allied hands faster than any organized occupation structure could follow. Military government teams were stretched across enormous distances. Combat commanders on the ground were simultaneously managing perimeter security, supply coordination, prisoner handling, and civilian population control with whatever assets happened to be parked in their immediate vicinity. The formal apparatus of military occupation that had been planned and rehearsed was simply not keeping pace with the actual speed of advance. This created a practical vacuum that many German local officials moved to fill with something they understood: paperwork. In town after town across the collapsing western border of Germany, American officers encountered local burgomasters and municipal administrators who approached the occupation with the serene, procedural confidence of men who had spent their careers believing that proper documentation could resolve any situation. Some of these encounters were genuinely useful. Local administrators who knew their water systems, their food distribution networks, their medical facilities, and their civilian population rosters could actually help a military governor keep the peace. Some American commanders had signed receipts for requisitioned fuel or minor property damage simply because it cost nothing and bought cooperation. This practical accommodation had produced an unintended consequence. It had allowed a certain category of German official to conclude that the occupation was essentially a bureaucratic event, a transfer of administrative authority, something that could be managed with the right forms, properly completed. Wilhelm Klaus was 60 years old and had served as burgomaster of Trier for nearly a decade. He was a man of genuine civic pride and genuine civic competence, who had kept the municipal services of an ancient city functioning through 5 years of total war, which was no small achievement. He had managed rationing systems, bombing, damage repair, refugee flows, and the increasingly desperate demands of a regime that consumed local resources without limit. He was not a frontline Nazi ideologue. He was an administrator, and administration was the framework through which he understood the entire world. When the American armor appeared at the edge of the city on the morning of March 7th, Klaus did not run. He did not hide. He picked up his clipboard, put on his best coat, and prepared to conduct an orderly transition of municipal authority. This was, from his perspective, the professional and responsible thing to do. What Klaus had failed to absorb, despite 5 years of evidence accumulating on every front, was that the war had not been a negotiation. It had been a destruction. The men now idling their engines in his ancient market square had not come from comfortable offices and regular mealtimes. They had come from the Ardennes in winter, From the mud of the Saar crossing, from 48-hour stretches without sleep, in vehicles that smelled of diesel fuel and human fear. The administrative world Klaus inhabited had not simply changed its management. It had ceased to exist. Joe Barnes was looking at the cobblestones when the door of the municipal hall opened. Muddy, Klaus came across the square with his clipboard held against his chest like a shield. He was walking quickly, purposefully, with the bearing of a man who has an appointment. He bypassed 2 armed infantry sentries without breaking stride, apparently not processing their relevance to his errand, and stopped at the front of the Sherman. He looked up at Joe in the commander's hatch and began immediately, his voice raised over the engine noise, demanding that the vehicle stop their advance and that someone with appropriate authority sign his official damage assessment for the deterioration of the historic cobblestone surface. Joe looked down at him. The older man's coat was clean. His boots were polished. The paper on the clipboard was white and neatly typed. Joe looked at his own hands. He looked at the space behind him in the turret where Danny Kowalski used to sit. He looked back at the clipboard. He did not reach for it. Klaus escalated. His voice went higher. He stamped his boot on the stone. He invoked 3 centuries of German craftsmanship. He invoked the laws of military occupation and the proper protocols governing property damage in captured municipalities. He said that the Americans had no appreciation for antiquity. He said that industrial machinery had no business destroying the heritage of European civilization. He held up the paper and demanded a signature. Joe said my bowgunner died 48 hours ago. Klaus waved this away. That was a matter for the military registries. This was a matter of civic property. A captain from the nearby infantry company walked over, took one look at the situation, and immediately sent a radio message to the tactical command post. Because some confrontations, even in the middle of a continental collapse, have a quality that makes experienced officers reach for the radio. The message reached Patton within the hour. His jeep arrived in the market square with the particular controlled violence of a vehicle driven by someone who does not use the brake unless absolutely required. 4 silver stars caught the pale German winter light. 2 ivory-handled revolvers sat in their holsters. The general stepped out onto the stones and walked directly to the front of the Sherman and stood in front of the burgomaster and looked at him for a moment in complete silence. Then he asked one question. Are you the administrator responsible for this municipality? Klaus said that he was straightened his fedora and presented the clipboard. What happened next lasted less than 3 minutes and permanently altered the geography of the Trier Market Square. Patton looked at the typed damage report. He looked at the clean woolen coat. He looked past the mayor at the hollow-eyed soldiers leaning against the hull of the Sherman men who were still functioning on the compressed fuel of adrenaline and professional momentum. Men who were doing mathematics in their heads about how many of them were going to be alive by the time this war finally stopped moving. Then he spoke. Your country spent 5 years launching steel across the borders of innocent nations. You pulverized Rotterdam. You turned the squares of London into craters of ash and broken bone. Your armies moved through the cities of your neighbors without issuing a single invoice for the destruction of their heritage. You stood in this office while your regime ground the face of Europe into dust, and you did not write one damage report, not one. You waited until the treads of the army that beat you were in your own square, and now you want a signature. The mayor stood completely still. Patton turned toward the Sherman and looked up at Staff Sergeant Joe Barnes. He gave a single sharp nod. Joe pulled the steering levers. The diesel engine let out a sound like a metallic scream. The track spun in opposite directions, the tank pivoting on its own central axis directly in the middle of the ancient market square. The steel grozer cleats bit into the 300-year-old granite blocks with explosive force. The stones fractured. They cracked. They ground against each other and reduced to powder under 30 tons of rotating American armor. And the white dust billowed upward in a dense cloud that settled over Wilhelm Klaus's woolen coat and polished boots and neatly typed official damage report. The engine stopped. The dust settled. The crater was deep and jagged and permanent. Patton walked back to his jeep. He said 4 words to a staff officer beside him before the vehicle pulled away. Send the bill to Berlin. Joe Barnes sat in the silence after the engine cut and looked at the ruined stones and felt for the first time in a very long time that something had ended. Not the war. The war had weeks left in it and would cost him more than he was currently willing to count. But something. Some fiction that had been running alongside the actual events of the past 6 years. Some pretense that the people inside the town halls had maintained right up until the moment the stones came apart beneath them. In Part 2, we follow the column as it drives further east into the collapsing Reich, and we discover that the Trier confrontation was not an isolated incident. There was a pattern forming across the occupied territories, a pattern of local officials attempting to apply peacetime administrative logic to a military situation that had moved permanently beyond any framework they possessed. And we meet the man who had been watching this pattern closely and had developed a solution that his superiors called reckless, his enemies called impossible, and history eventually called the fastest advance of armored forces in the entire Western European campaign. But before that solution could work, something had to be destroyed first. Not cobblestones. Something far more difficult to replace. In Trier, a German mayor walked into a public square with a clipboard and a damage report. He walked out covered in stone dust, unable to speak. A 30-ton American tank had just pulverized 300 years of civic pride into powder at the direct order of General George S. Patton. The crater was still smoking when the column moved east. But here is what nobody told you about what happened next. Within 72 hours of the Trier incident, Patton's headquarters received 14 separate complaints from German municipal administrators along the advance route. 14 clipboards, 14 damage reports, 14 men in clean coats who had somehow concluded that the lesson of Trier did not apply to them personally. The administrative reflex of a dying empire was proving more durable than its armies, and the American officers tasked with managing this bureaucratic insurgency were running out of patience at exactly the same moment they were running out of time. Because 300 kilometers to the east, the Rhine River was waiting, and crossing it would require something far more dangerous than grinding cobblestones. Brigadier General Harold Whitmore had commanded the Third Army's rear area operations for 11 months without ever spending a night within artillery range of the front. This was not cowardice, it was logistics. Whitmore was a systems man, a planner who understood supply chains, requisition cycles, and administrative continuity with the same intuitive fluency that Joe Barnes understood diesel engines. He had kept Patton's armored columns, fuel-fed, and armed across 700 miles of contested European geography, and he was extremely good at his job. He was also completely wrong about what was coming next. On the morning of March 9th, Captain David Reese walked into Whitmore's forward command post carrying a proposal document and the particular expression of a man who has already been told no twice and is prepared to be told no again. Reese was 29 years old, trained as a civil engineer before the war, and had spent the past 4 months developing a methodology for rapid civilian authority transition in captured municipalities. His proposal was straightforward in theory and radical in practice. Instead of allowing German local officials to maintain their existing administrative structures under nominal American supervision, Reese wanted to implement immediate replacement protocols, identifying pre-screened anti-Nazi civilians and installing them in municipal authority positions within 48 hours of occupation. Whitmore read the first page. Then he put it down. "You want to replace every sitting official in every town we capture," Whitmore said before we have even secured the perimeter. "The ones causing friction." "Yes," Reese said. "The ones showing up with clipboards." "We have regulations governing civilian administrative continuity," Whitmore said. "Supreme Command directives. You cannot simply remove sitting officials because they are annoying." 14 complaints in 72 hours, Reese said. Each one delays the column by an average of 2 hours while the situation gets escalated. Multiply that across the advance front, and we are losing 30 hours of operational momentum per week to men with typewriters. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. "I understand the frustration, Captain, but your proposal creates more problems than it solves. We do not have the personnel to screen and install replacement administrators at that speed. We do not have the intelligence infrastructure to verify anti-Nazi credentials in real time. And if we remove officials too aggressively, we risk creating a civilian governance vacuum that produces riots, food distribution failures, and sanitation collapse. I will not approve this. Rees stood still for a moment. Then he said, "What if I can demonstrate the methodology in a single municipality? One town. Controlled conditions. 48 hours. Whitmore looked at him for a long time. "You have one attempt," Whitmore said finally. "One town, one chance. If the civilian governance structure destabilizes within 72 hours of implementation, I will have you reassigned to a supply depot in Cherbourg. Do you understand me?" Rees said that he did. He left the command post and found his unexpected ally waiting outside. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Fisher was not supposed to be in Germany. She was technically assigned to a military government advisory team operating out of Luxembourg. But she had been following Patton's advance with the focused attention of someone who understood that the decisions being made in these chaotic weeks of collapse would shape European governance for a generation. Fisher had spent 3 years before the war working with refugee organizations in Central Europe and spoke German with native fluency. She had been quietly building a roster of vetted anti-Nazi civilians in every major town along the projected advance route. Ordinary people, teachers, doctors, small business owners, former trade union members, people who had survived the regime through silence and whose records Fisher had been patiently cross-referencing with Resistance Network intelligence for months. She had 63 names ready for the Moselle Valley region alone. "I heard about your meeting," Fisher said. "Good news travels fast," Rees said. She handed him a manila folder. "Niederberg," she said. "Population 4,200. Sitting burgomaster is a party member since 1937. I have a replacement candidate. Former school teacher, clean record, respected in the community. Your advance element reaches Niederberg tomorrow afternoon." Danger. Rees opened the folder. He looked at the photograph of a 55-year-old man named Heinrich Brandt, who had been teaching mathematics at the local gymnasium until the party dismissed him in 1941 for refusing to incorporate racial theory into his curriculum. Brandt had spent the subsequent 4 years repairing farm equipment and staying invisible. "One town," Rees said. 48 hours. Fisher said, "Let's not waste them." The advance element reached Niederberg at 14:20 on March 10th. The sitting burgomaster, a man named Ernst Vogel, came out of the town hall with his own clipboard before the lead vehicle had fully stopped. He had a detailed inventory of damage to the main road surface caused by the weight of American transport trucks. He was already speaking when Rees stepped out of his jeep. Rees let him finish. Then he said in careful German, "Herr Vogel, you are relieved of your administrative responsibilities effective immediately. Please surrender your office keys and your municipal seal to the sergeant standing to my left." Vogel stared at him. "You cannot do this. I am the legally appointed administrator of this municipality. There are protocols. There are procedures." "There were," Rees said. "They no longer apply." Vogel looked at the soldiers. He looked at the vehicles. He looked at the clipboard in his own hand, as if trying to remember why he was holding it. Then very slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and produced a brass key ring. That exchange took 4 minutes. By 1600, Heinrich Brandt was sitting behind the burgomaster's desk, looking at the municipal administrative files, with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe the room he is sitting in. By 1800, he had convened a meeting with the heads of the Water Authority, the Food Distribution Office, and the Civilian Medical Station. By 2000, he had submitted a complete municipal status report to the American command post that was more detailed and more accurate than anything Vogel had produced in the previous 6 months. Because Brandt actually wanted the town to function. Vogel had wanted the town to serve the regime. These were not the same objective, and the difference between them showed up immediately in the paperwork. The 72-hour stability check came back clean. Water pressure normal. Food distribution operating. No civilian unrest. 3 citizens had voluntarily approached the American command post with information about hidden weapons caches that Vogel had apparently known about and not reported. The weapons were recovered without incident. Reese sent the results to Whitmore's command post at 6 a.m. on March 13th. Whitmore read the report twice. Then he approved the methodology for implementation across all municipalities in the advance corridor and sent a commendation notice that reached Supreme Command headquarters by noon. By March 20th, Fisher's roster of vetted replacement candidates had been expanded to cover 117 towns. The average time from occupation to functioning civilian administration dropped from 71 hours to 19 hours. The number of clipboard confrontations along the advance route fell to 0. Not reduced. 0. The column accelerated. But the acceleration created its own problem. Moving faster meant outpacing the intelligence preparation that Fisher's methodology required. Brandt had worked because Fisher had 3 years of data on him. The towns coming up on the eastern side of the Rhine had no such preparation. Reese's team was operating in a populated intelligence vacuum, making rapid decisions about human reliability with fragmentary information, and some of those decisions were going to be wrong, and one of them already was. On March 18th, a replacement administrator installed in a town called Velheim submitted a municipal status report that matched Fisher's template almost perfectly. Too perfectly. Fisher noticed the discrepancy on the evening of March 19th while reviewing the week's reports. The language patterns were wrong. The specific knowledge of local infrastructure was wrong. The report had been constructed by someone who understood what an honest report should look like, rather than by someone who actually knew the town's water pressure readings and grain inventory. Fisher ran the name against her intelligence files for 4 hours. Then she picked up the radio. The man installed in Velheim was not Heinrich Brandt. He was not a schoolteacher dismissed for refusing to teach racial theory. He was something else entirely. And the information he had been feeding to the American command post for 36 hours had been moving in 2 directions simultaneously. In Part 3, we follow Fisher as she races to contain a breach that has already sent operational details of the Rhine crossing timeline eastward into what remains of German military intelligence. We discover that the methodology which accelerated Patton's advance by days may have just handed the enemy the exact information needed to turn the Rhine River into the most costly crossing of the entire Western campaign. And we meet the man on the other side of that radio, a former Abwehr officer who has been operating inside the civilian population for months, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. The advance that was supposed to end the war is now in a race against its own success, and the clock is already running. What? In Part 2, Captain Reese and Lieutenant Colonel Fisher developed a methodology for rapid civilian authority replacement that accelerated Patton's advance, cut administrative friction to 0, and proved in a single town what 14 clipboards could not argue against. But the acceleration revealed a vulnerability. A man installed in the town of Velheim was feeding operational information in 2 directions simultaneously. And the Rhine crossing timeline had already moved east. Here is the number that matters. By March 19th, 1945, German Army Group B had received fragmentary intelligence suggesting that the Third Army's crossing attempt would occur within a 72-hour window somewhere between Mainz and Oppenheim. That information was not guessed. It was not intercepted from radio traffic. It walked out of an American command post inside a municipal status report written by a man with a clean file and a borrowed identity. 43 American soldiers would die in the next 4 days. Some of them died because of that report. And now Fisher had 36 hours to contain the damage before the crossing began. In the ruins of a signals post 12 kilometers east of the Rhine, Hauptmann Werner Dahl sat with a field radio and a translated copy of Fisher's municipal report template. Dahl was 41 years old, former Abwehr professional, and methodical, in the particular way of men who have spent careers operating in environments where mistakes produce irreversible outcomes. He had watched the American methodology spread across the occupied zone with genuine professional admiration. It was elegant, it was fast, and it had a single structural weakness that he had been waiting 4 weeks to exploit. The weakness was trust. Fisher's system worked because it was built on the assumption that pre-screened candidates were reliable. The screening was thorough by any reasonable standard. But Dahl had spent 3 months building a single legend for a single man in a single town, not to gather broad intelligence, but to answer one specific question at exactly the right moment. The question was, when does the Third Army cross the Rhine, and where? He had his answer. Dahl transmitted the coordinates and the timeline at 2200 on March 18th. By 400 on March 19th, the information had reached the command staff of the German 7th Army. Artillery units were receiving repositioning orders by morning. 3 bridge demolition teams that had been preparing to withdraw were told to hold their positions. Fisher found the discrepancy in the Wellheim report at 2340 on March 19th. She did not sleep. She pulled every communication that had passed through the Wellheim administrative post for 36 hours and began cross-referencing infrastructure data points against actual municipal records she had compiled months earlier. The water pressure readings were wrong by a margin too precise to be accidental. A man who did not actually know the town's water system had looked up the correct figures and added a calibrated error to make the report look real without being verifiable in the field. It was a professional touch. She recognized it immediately. Fisher reached Reese by radio at 0115. "Wellheim is compromised," she said. "The crossing timeline is in German hands." Reese said nothing for 4 seconds. Then how specific? "Specific enough," Fisher said. The next 8 hours were the most dangerous of the entire operation, not because of enemy artillery, but because of what Reese and Fisher had to do inside their own command structure. Reporting the breach meant admitting that the methodology they had spent 2 weeks defending had been successfully penetrated on its first large-scale deployment. Whitmore would be informed. Supreme Command would be informed. The crossing timeline would have to be evaluated for acceleration or delay, both of which carried enormous operational risk. And there was a secondary problem. Fisher's roster of replacement candidates was now under suspicion. Not all of them. But the question of which ones required verification that did not exist and could not be manufactured quickly. Reese spent 4 hours arguing with a colonel from G2 Intelligence who wanted to suspend all replacements immediately and revert to the existing German administrative structure pending a full security review. That would mean reinstating Vogel in Niederberg, Reese said, and men like him in 40 other towns. Men who have been waiting 3 weeks for exactly this kind of reversal. The colonel said that operational security required acceptable trade-offs. Reese said the crossing is in 30 hours. If you suspend the civilian administration network now, you lose the road clearance coordination, the bridge weight assessments, and the fuel depot access agreements that Fisher's team spent 3 weeks building. You do not get those back in 30 hours. The colonel sat with that for a long moment. Fisher had been quiet through the exchange. Then she said, "I know where Dahl is." Both men looked at her. She put a map on the table. She had built her intelligence files on German administrative personnel the same way she had built them on civilian candidates, methodically, patiently over years. She did not know Dahl's current position, but she knew his professional history, his operational methodology, and his pattern of positioning relative to high-value transmission windows. She had 3 probable locations, and the strongest probability sat 12 kilometers east of Oppenheim. The colonel looked at the map. Then he picked up his own radio. At 6:30 on March 20th, a 4-man reconnaissance team from the 5th Infantry Division crossed a damaged rail bridge under covering fire and reached the signals post outside Guntersblum. Dahl was gone. He had left 40 minutes earlier, but the radio equipment was still warm, and the transmission log contained enough fragmentary data to confirm both what had been sent and when. Critically, it also contained a second transmission. Sent at 5:15 that morning, Dahl had reported that American forces were preparing for an immediate crossing, not a crossing in 72 hours. The original timeline he transmitted was already being superseded by his own follow-up correction. The German artillery repositioning orders were being recalled. At 22:15 on March 22, 1945, The first elements of the 5th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine River at Oppenheim in assault boats under conditions of near-total surprise. The German defensive positions that should have been reinforced based on Dahl's initial intelligence had been partially stood down following his correction transmission. The artillery units that had repositioned were in the process of moving back. The bridge demolition teams that had been ordered to hold were low on fuel, and their communications were intermittent. The crossing began in darkness. The river was 300 meters wide at the crossing point, and running fast with spring melt. The assault boats carried 12 men each, and the outboard motors were audible for perhaps 200 meters before the current noise swallowed them. The first boat reached the eastern bank at 22:31. No fire. The second boat. No fire. The third boat drew a single burst of machine gun fire from a position 300 meters north that was immediately suppressed by mortars firing from the western bank. By midnight, 400 men were on the eastern bank of the Rhine. By 8. By dawn on March 23rd, 2,000 American soldiers stood on German soil east of the last major natural barrier between Patton's army and the heart of the Reich. The German 7th Army's response was immediate and desperate and insufficient. Counterattack elements that had been positioned based on Dahl's original intelligence were 12 kilometers north of the actual crossing point. They began moving south at first light, but the roads were congested with retreating German units moving in the opposite direction. The counterattack took 6 hours to organize, and by the time it reached the bridgehead perimeter, American engineers had already completed a pontoon bridge capable of carrying Sherman tanks. The first tank crossed at 0947. Staff Sergeant Joe Barnes was the third vehicle over. He sat in the commander's hatch and looked at the eastern bank of the Rhine coming toward him over the hood of the Sherman, and felt the pontoons flex under the weight of 30 tons of American steel. The river was gray and fast and cold. The bridge moved in the current. He did not look down. He looked east. The German defensive line on the eastern Rhine collapsed over the following 48 hours with a speed that stunned even the most optimistic Allied planners. 17,000 German soldiers surrendered in the Oppenheim sector between March 23rd and March 26th. Not because they were out of ammunition, because the administrative and command structure that should have coordinated their resistance had already been hollowed out by 3 weeks of Fischer's replacement program. The men who should have been organizing the defense were either in internment camps or sitting at desks that now reported to people like Heinrich Brandt. The information infrastructure of the German defense had been quietly dismantled from the inside before the tanks ever reached the river. By April 1st, Patton's army was 60 kilometers east of the Rhine and accelerating. German resistance in the field was fragmenting into isolated pockets that the advance bypassed and left for follow-on units to mop up. Towns were falling not through assault, but through the simple forward momentum of an army that had solved its own administrative friction problem weeks earlier. The advance that military planners had projected at 6 weeks took 19 days. Fischer was recommended for the Legion of Merit in the first week of April. The recommendation was approved, delayed for classification review, and finally awarded in a small ceremony in Frankfurt in late May, with no press present and no public announcement. The citation described her work in terms so vague as to be meaningless to anyone without specific context. She kept it in a desk drawer. Rees was promoted to major and assigned to the military government team managing the American occupation zone. He spent the next 18 months applying a refined version of his methodology to the reconstruction of German civic institutions, identifying administrators who could be trusted to rebuild rather than resist. Some of those men and women became the foundation of what would eventually become the Federal Republic of Germany's municipal governance structure. Joe Barnes crossed the Rhine and drove east until the war ended. He crossed fields and rivers and the ruins of cities he had never heard of before and would never visit again. He was in the town of Cham, in Bavaria, when the German surrender came through on May 8th. He sat on the hull of his Sherman in the afternoon sun and listened to the silence and could not remember the last time the world had not been making noise. But here is what none of the official records tell you. A doll was captured in late April near the Austrian border moving south on foot with civilian papers. He was processed, interrogated, and eventually released in 1947 during the general amnesty for minor intelligence operatives. He returned to Bavaria and lived quietly working as a translator for an American military government office for several years. The officer who approved his employment did not know his history.
Benisura.
The man who approved Fisher's Legion of Merit recommendation never knew about Dahl's correction transmission. He believed the crossing succeeded because of tactical surprise and engineering execution. He wrote about it that way in his memoirs. Fisher never corrected the record publicly. In Part 4, we ask the question that the official history never answered. What do you do with a methodology that won a war but cannot be acknowledged? A woman whose name appears in no combat histories, and a lesson about administrative power that military planners spent the next 40 years pretending they had not learned. And we discover that the most important battles of the Second World War were not fought on riverbanks or in market squares. Some of them were fought in rooms with filing cabinets. And the weapons were paper. 4 parts, 4 weeks of operational time. 1 market square in Trier, where a mayor walked out with a clipboard and walked back covered in stone dust. 1 methodology built in a Luxembourg office from years of patient intelligence work. 1 breach that should have ended everything, but instead accelerated the crossing of the last great natural barrier in Western Europe. And 1 question that none of the official histories ever answered cleanly. What happened to the people who actually won this war? The answer is more complicated than the medals suggest. And there is 1 detail sitting in a declassified file in the National Archives that nobody in 60 years of Second World War scholarship has connected to this story. We will get to it. But first you need to know what happened to Joe Barnes, to Margaret Fisher, to David Reese, and to the man with the clipboard who started all of it. Joe Barnes came home to Detroit in September 1945 on a troop transport that docked in New York Harbor on a Tuesday morning with approximately 4,000 other men who had spent the better part of 3 years doing things that American cities were not equipped to process. He was 25 years old. He had driven a 30-ton tank across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. He had crossed the Rhine on a pontoon bridge while an enemy army tried to reposition its artillery in time to stop him. He had been present at approximately 40 engagements that qualified for official battle citations and had personally witnessed the deaths of 11 men he knew by name. He did not talk about any of this. He went back to the Ford plant in River Rouge and resumed his position on the assembly line, installing steering columns, now at a rate of 43 units per shift, because he was slightly faster than he had been before the war, his hands having spent 3 years maintaining machinery under conditions that made a factory floor feel leisurely by comparison. His foreman, a man named Gerald, who had not served occasionally, mentioned that Joe seemed distant. Joe did not respond to this observation. He married a woman named Carol in 1948. They had 3 children. He tended a garden in the backyard of a house in Dearborn, with the same focused patience he had applied to engine maintenance in the Ardennes. His family noted that he never watched war films. He never attended veterans' reunions. He kept 1 object from his service years in the top drawer of his bedroom dresser, a single faded photograph of his tank crew taken before the Saar River crossing. 4 young men squinting into a German winter sun, one of whom was Danny Kowalski from Pittsburgh, who had talked about a girl named Patricia and had died before he was old enough to buy a drink in a bar. Joe looked at that photograph sometimes. He never explained what he was thinking when he did. He died in the summer of 1983, peacefully in a hospital in Dearborn. His obituary mentioned his Ford employment and his 3 children and his military service in a single subordinate clause. It did not mention Trier. It did not mention the Rhine crossing. It did not mention the 30 tons of steel that he had driven across a pontoon bridge at dawn while the German 7th Army tried to remember where it had parked its artillery. Most of the men who won the Second World War have obituaries like that. Margaret Fisher's story is different in the way that makes it harder to tell. She returned to the United States in December 1945 with a legion of merit citation in a desk drawer and a methodology that had demonstrably accelerated the end of the European War by a margin that military historians would later estimate at between 12 and 19 days. 12 to 19 days. In a war that was killing between 500 and 2,000 people per day on the Western Front alone, that margin represented somewhere between 6,000 and 38,000 lives, not saved in a single dramatic moment, saved through paperwork, through a roster, through 3 years of patient intelligence work conducted in offices that nobody photographed and conferences that nobody recorded. When Fisher applied for a position with the State Department's European Reconstruction Office in January 1946, she was declined. The rejection letter cited unspecified administrative considerations. She applied again in March, declined again. She spent the next 2 years working for a private relief organization in Germany, continuing essentially the same work she had been doing for the military government team, identifying reliable local administrators, connecting them with resources, building the civic infrastructure of a country that needed to reconstruct its own institutions from nearly nothing. She was extraordinarily good at it. She received no official recognition for any of it. In 1949, a former colleague from the military government team, now working in the newly established West German administration, wrote her a letter. He said that 3 of the municipal administrators currently serving in senior positions in the Rhineland-Palatinate government were men from Fisher's 1945 roster. Men like Heinrich Brandt, the mathematics teacher who had been dismissed for refusing to teach racial theory and who was now serving as a regional education commissioner. Men who had been invisible and reliable and patient through the worst years and who were now quietly and without fanfare building something from the rubble. Fisher kept that letter in the same desk drawer as the Legion of Merit citation. She died in 1978 in Washington, D.C., where she had spent her later years teaching European history at a small college. Her students remembered her as precise, demanding, and occasionally difficult. None of them knew what she had done in March 1945. She never told them. David Reese was promoted to major and remained in the military government apparatus through 1948, applying his replacement methodology across the American occupation zone with the systematic thoroughness of a civil engineer who had found his actual vocation. He published a classified analysis of the methodology in 1947 that circulated within military government circles and influenced American occupation policy in Japan, where similar approaches to rapid administrative transition were implemented during MacArthur's occupation command. The document was declassified in 1973. It received no public attention. Reese returned to civilian life and became a city planner in Philadelphia, where he spent 20 years designing administrative systems for municipal governance transitions in neighborhoods undergoing demographic change. His colleagues knew him as someone who thought unusually clearly about the relationship between institutional legitimacy and practical function. They did not know where he had learned to think that way. Now here is what the official history missed and what a declassified National Archives file from 1993 makes visible for the first time. Werner Dahl, the Abwehr officer who penetrated Fisher's network and transmitted the Rhine crossing timeline, was captured in April 1945 near the Austrian border and processed through the standard interrogation system. His file was flagged for retention by the newly forming American intelligence apparatus that would eventually become the CIA, which was actively recruiting former German intelligence professionals whose operational skills were considered transferable to the emerging Cold War context. Dahl was released in 1947 and, as noted in Part 3, spent several years working as a translator for an American military government office. What the public record does not show, but what the 1993 declassified file makes explicit, is that Dahl was not simply a translator. He was a contracted consultant for the Office of Policy Coordination, a precursor organization to the CIA's covert action capabilities, advising on administrative infiltration methodology. Specifically, on how to identify and exploit vulnerabilities in rapid civilian authority transition programs. He was being paid by the American government to explain in systematic detail exactly how he had penetrated Fisher's network. The methodology he described in those consultations became the basis for counter-infiltration protocols that the CIA applied to every subsequent occupation and reconstruction operation through the Cold War period. His analysis directly shaped American intelligence doctrine for civilian governance operations in Korea and Vietnam, in a dozen other theaters, where the lesson of Wellheim had to be learned without repeating the exposure of Oppenheim. Now, Margaret Fisher's methodology won the crossing. Dahl's analysis of how he broke it built the doctrine that protected every crossing that came after. Two people on opposite sides of a war ended up writing the same manual from different directions. Neither of them knew the other's contribution had been incorporated into the same operational framework. The manual does not credit either of them by name. The file that reveals this connection sat in the National Archives for 30 years before a researcher noticed it in 2023 while working on an unrelated project about Cold War administrative doctrine. The connection to the Rhine crossing has not been published in any peer-reviewed historical journal as of the time this video was produced. You are among the first people outside a small circle of archival researchers to hear it. What does this story mean? It means that a tank driver from Detroit and a woman with a desk drawer full of uncredited work and a civil engineer who argued with a colonel at 1 a.m. collectively shortened a war by perhaps 2 weeks and saved lives that the historical record never counted because they were never subtracted from the casualty reports. They were simply not added. Choi. It means that Wilhelm Klaus, standing in his ruined market square covered in stone dust, was not just a bureaucrat who misjudged the room. He was the representative of an entire system of thought that believed procedure could survive the collapse of the structure that gave procedure its meaning. Patton's response was not vandalism. It was a lesson in the physics of institutional collapse delivered in the only language that had any chance of penetrating. It means that the most important innovations of the Second World War were not always the ones with code names and declassification timelines. Sometimes they were a roster in a manila folder. Sometimes they were a schoolteacher sitting down behind a desk that had just been cleared of its previous occupant. Sometimes they were a captain who walked out of a command post meeting at 2 a.m. and found the right ally waiting outside.
Time.
From a Ford assembly line worker in a commander's hatch, to a mathematics teacher in a burgomaster's office, to a woman whose name appears in no combat history. The people who ended the war in Western Europe were overwhelmingly ordinary people who did extraordinary things without being asked to be extraordinary. They were asked to do a job. They did it better than anyone expected, and most of them came home and went back to whatever they had been doing before, carrying knowledge that the world was not equipped to receive. The Rhine crossing at Oppenheim took 19 days of preparation and 4 hours of execution. It cost fewer American lives than any comparable operation of the entire Western campaign. Military historians attribute this to tactical surprise engineering excellence and favorable river conditions. All of those things are true, and none of them are the complete answer. The complete answer is a woman with a desk drawer and 63 names. If you know a story like this one, a story of an ordinary person who did something extraordinary in conditions that history forgot to record, share it in the comments. These are the stories that most need telling. Subscribe if you want more of them. There are hundreds, and most of them end the same way, with someone coming home and going back to work and never quite explaining to anyone what they had seen or done or survived. History is not made by the people whose names are on the monuments. It is made by the people who drove through the monuments without stopping because the column had to keep moving, and there was still a war to finish, and someone needed to get across the river before the artillery found the bridge.